It's my great pleasure to deliver the 2013 National Infrastructure Oration. As a former public servant, as a businessman, as a patron, of course, of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, as President of the Business Council of Australia, and of course as Chairman of the Greater Western Sydney Giants. We play on Saturday. Infrastructure has been the constant that has run through my working life, and I owe this sector, all of you in the room and in this room and many others, a great deal of gratitude. As I reflect back across my career, I can see that I've been lucky to work alongside many of you to deliver infrastructure that will serve this country long after we've moved on. There are few sectors that offer the opportunity to fundamentally and directly change the country and improve living standards. At the Business Council, we recognise that investment in economic infrastructure is fundamental to lifting our productivity. And that is why I am so proud of what this sector and Australia's governments have achieved together over the past 30 years. When we reflect on what Australia has achieved over the past several decades, it's breathtaking. Australia's community, the business sector and governments have, through deliberate and focused reform to both infrastructure and to the structure of our economy, left us a rich, diverse and successful country. We have fundamentally changed the way we conceive, fund, deliver, own and operate infrastructure. Deregulated banking and floated the Aussie dollar, undertaken progressive reforms to remove tariff protections and expose the economy to global markets, and the difficult restructuring of national infrastructure markets in electricity, telecommunications, freight and aviation. Those bold reforms have underpinned 2 decades of national prosperity and economic opportunity. But these changes were not by accident. These were not the fruit of the status quo. These changes were brought about by a generation of heroic reformers, people like Hawke, Keating, Greiner, Kennett, Olsen and Howard. And of course your chairman, Mark Birrell, who was an integral part of the Kennett reformist machine. And having experienced it, a machine it was. These people, backed by innovative public servants and the deepening sophistication of the Australia's business sector, fundamentally changed this country for the better. But in my observation, some of that urgency, drive and determination has been replaced by a cautious approach to public administration, quite often driven by the news cycle, but also driven by the difficult fiscal position of the states. Policy heroism has in some jurisdictions and it's sometimes been lost to policy conformism and a focus on the status quo. In the context of a national election, backlit by a troubled global economy and shrinking economic productivity, and in the context of a business sector and a community that are demanding real solutions to Australia's infrastructure challenges, the time has come for Australia's governments to lead the business and broader communities in a real discussion about the options and pathways to a brighter economic future. Standing still is not an option. And caution must give way to leadership from policymakers and consensus between the federal and state governments on the priorities, and hopefully bipartisan support. Of course, it's been a long time since we've seen anything enjoying bipartisan support. My oration this evening will reflect on my own experiences in this sector before turning to what I think are the greatest hurdles facing Australia's infrastructure sector. As Jeff has said, I began my career as a public servant overseeing the delivery of the Moomba-Sydney gas pipeline by the Federal Pipeline Authority, which was created by the famous Rex Connor. But quite rightly, having been developed by government, it was rightfully sold to the private sector, and perhaps that is a model for the future. This experience taught me much about contracting and the delivery of projects and the union movement, and exposed me to Australia's construction sector during a time of substantial national investment. I must say I loved construction right from the get-go, so joining Transfield in the late 1970s was a natural fit. With your indulgence, I'd like to use this speech to place on record my gratitude to my friend and mentor Franco Belgiorno Nettis and the Salteri family and the wonderful professionals and innovative thinkings within Transfield. Through Transfield and other roles, I've worked on some of Australia's largest projects, including the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, Anzac Warships, Melbourne City Link and Eastlink. But it's the Sydney Harbour Tunnel upon which I want to reflect this evening, because it was that project, more than any others I was involved with, that encapsulates the leadership and entrepreneurialism that existed among Australians' professional public servants and business sectors at that time. And I believe that this approach holds lessons for contemporary political leaders, public officials and the private sector. In many ways, the Sydney Harbour Tunnel was as much a change in philosophy as it was a successful infrastructure project. In the mid-1980s, the New South Wales government, like other states, was facing a tough fiscal situation. Moreover, Australia's economy remained largely insulated from global markets, and our infrastructure services were owned, regulated and operated by the public sector in an uncontested and, may I say, a very inefficient market. In 1985, the Hawke government announced the deregulation of Australia's financial systems, together with other reforms, removed the impediments to the entry of foreign capital and global expertise. It was against that backdrop that we took a highly innovative and unique unsolicited proposal to the New South Wales government for a private consortium comprising of Transfield and our Japanese partner Kumagai to finance, deliver, own and operate a new tunnel beneath Sydney Harbour. The project was not easy because it broke new ground on many fronts. PPPs did not exist in Australia at that time. This was a time when governments owned all roads, power stations, the Commonwealth Bank, the National Shipping Line, Qantas and Telecom. Neither the public nor the private sector had considered how projects could be delivered through any model other than through a traditional public works delivery method. Indeed, there was no process at all to deal with an unsolicited bid, let alone private financing for public infrastructure projects. I should add that the Rand government had called for innovative ideas for a second harbour tunnel, and our first go at a proposal was in fact a bridge from Ball's Head to Balmain. Could you imagine the reaction today? It's almost worth doing it, isn't it? The lack of either experience or process made the Sydney Harbour Tunnel rich with complexities. In the absence of established frameworks, the New South Wales government brought the project forward under its own project-specific legislation. We funded the feasibility and the EIS at our own cost and risk. We had to meet KPIs set by the government in terms of quality, functionality and the level of tolls. My good friend Nick Greiner, then a young opposition leader, definitely on the move, had something to say against the project. He highlighted the lack of a competitive process, the revenue guarantee and transfer between the existing bridge and the new tunnel as major problems in the way it was contracted. No doubt, with the benefit of the deep experience that now exists, things would have been done differently. But we need to remember that this was not a routine procurement. Rather, the project was an exciting pathfinder that permanently changed the established roles of the public and private sectors in Australia in project finance and delivery. But my contention tonight is that, read together, the Rand government's procurement of the Sydney Harbour Tunnel and Nick Greiner's principled opposition developed the PPP market that has underpinned the delivery of some of Australia's most important and transformational projects. In fact, Greiner backed up his concern with a dedicated PPP policy framework upon his election to government in 1998. In fact, Gary Sturgis is here, probably wrote it. The Greiner government's guidelines for private sector involvement in infrastructure provision provided the first clearly articulated governance structure for Australian PPP projects, which over time became the New South Wales Working with Government guidelines. Indeed, many of the principles laid down in that foundation document remain current in the present day. The guidelines required a robust, competitive and transparent tender process and codified the allocation of project and operational risks for major projects. There is also now, of course, a formal process for dealing with unsolicited proposals. Nick's own signature project, Sydney's M2 motorway, was a much easier transaction because of the learnings from the Sydney Harbour Tunnel and the scrutable process outlined in his government's guidance policies. As with the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, the M2 motorway's procurement allowed for further refinement of the model, which served as a template for other roads and PPPs that followed and other PPP projects. And while Victoria may not like to admit it, it served as the case study for the procurement of the Great Melbourne City Link project. City Link also showed the kind of innovation that could be delivered through a PPP project. The Transurban Consortium delivered the world's first free-flow multi-lane tolling system as a part of the project's output specification. And just to make it truly complicated, we coupled it with an IPO of Transurban, now a major global toll road owner and operator, and I think they're up the back there tonight, so welcome Transurban. We've come a long way since the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. With the benefits of the lessons learned on that and subsequent projects, Australia's states have developed varying acumen in the private delivery of public infrastructure. But now, in the face of the growing infrastructure investment backlog, high levels of government debt, skills and labour shortages, and high project costs, it's time to give renewed thought as to how Australia can bring the efforts of the states and federal governments together. How to provide new solutions to the infrastructure shortfalls that are eroding our national competitiveness, increasing cost of living pressures, and lowering our quality of life. It's time for a much greater level of national engagement in infrastructure. To date, Infrastructure Australia and the federal government have focused on structures and statistics, and these are important. The current public policy debate about the need for long-term, multi-decade strategic infrastructure planning is fundamental, and this planning must be integrated with land use planning. Real long-term plans allow for a much earlier identification and assessment of major projects and allow Australian governments and the infrastructure sector alike to marshal the financial and human resources needed to deliver the next generation of infrastructure projects. And I acknowledge the work undertaken by Minister Albanese in this regard. The formation of Infrastructure Australia will in time be seen as a critical milestone in the development of Australia's national infrastructure market. It was established to advise the federal government on policy reforms and priorities in infrastructure. And Infrastructure Australia has made some progress, particularly through the adoption of nationally consistent PPP frameworks, which still reflect some of the lessons from the Sydney Harbour Tunnel project all those many years ago. Its insistence on thorough cost-benefit analysis and the priority of projects is essential, given the scarcity of capital and the temptation of project politicisation. Infrastructure Australia has also begun the difficult task of building a better pipeline of national projects, including PPPs. These steps towards a prioritised project pipeline are important. Creating real certainty about what projects will commence and in what order will serve to increase competition in the infrastructure market, unlock new sources of capital, and give both business and taxpayers visibility about what projects will be delivered and how they will be financed. But much remains to be done. The plan was for the federal government to co-invest with the states in projects which met national criteria. Good reforms at a state level would see federal support for state projects. But unfortunately, the domestic impact of global economic challenges have seen the federal government make few investments in the past few years. I can perhaps understand the hesitation of the federal government to undertake further spending, but this is a time for policy heroism, not a time for managing a genteel decline in national prosperity. It's never been cheaper in the history of the Federation for the federal government to borrow. Borrowing for prioritised infrastructure projects with a positive cost benefit can be characterised as good borrowing, as distinct from borrowing to fund recurring expenditure or low priority infrastructure with a negative cost benefit, which I'd characterise as bad borrowing. Australia's states are, like the 1980s, suffering from relatively high levels of debt and challenging budget situations. Queensland and South Australia have been downgraded by rating agencies in the past few years. While New South Wales and Western Australia remained up AAA rated, they have been placed on a negative outlook. Australia needs to recapture the reformist appetite and policy bravery that allowed us to take such substantial steps forward between 1985 and 2000. What is needed in Australia is bold national policy leadership, supported by a mechanism to reward or sanction states for achieving complex reforms. Much has been said about nation building in the context of new projects, but nation building is as much about removing the false borders and lack of contestability in national infrastructure markets such as energy, transport and health services as it is about building sites. The Commonwealth must be at the table as sometimes regulator and funder of national infrastructure markets. The Commonwealth should be leveraging the relative strength of its balance sheet to encourage reforms at a state level. As I've said, Commonwealth debt has never been cheaper. Indeed, national policymakers need look no further than the advice of the Infrastructure Finance Working Group or the excellent valedictory speech by retiring Productivity Commissioner Chairman Gary Branks if the case for reform is unclear. Australia's pressing productivity challenge, high levels of public sector debt and continuing growth in government operating expenses demand a new period of experimentation to further refine the roles of the public and private sector in the delivery of major projects and in the delivery of public services. Australian governments are now comfortable with the use of PPPs in the delivery of major hospitals like Royal Sydney North Shore or Melbourne's Royal Children's. With spiralling health costs, one of the major policy challenges facing Australian governments, health is a clear area where experimentation with new models is warranted. Western Australia and Queensland are already tackling this issue, with Western Australia including clinical services within its recent hospital PPP, while Queensland has taken a different approach, announcing that it will seek to contract out large sections of clinical health services as it moves to create a contestable market for health service delivery. This is the kind of policy entrepreneurship that is needed across all of Australia's states and the federal government, which is why it was disappointing to see the Federal Treasurer oppose Queensland's moves to reduce its unsustainable recurrent health funding. Spending, I should say, not funding. So too are the deliberate moves by the New South Wales government to reduce inefficient recurrent spending and rebase the budget through asset sales. Privatisation, unfortunately, continues to be a bad word for all Australian politicians. That's why the New South Wales government should be recognised, because it has honestly and transparently led a discussion with voters about the challenges and options for infrastructure funding. The sale of the desal plant, the generators and now 2 major seaports has been accompanied by honesty from the New South Wales government about its fiscal position and the trade-offs needed to fund new projects. Progress on the vital WestConnex project and the North West Rail Link are a direct result of these sales. This level of honesty would benefit from corresponding leadership and support from the federal government. We need bipartisan support for well-considered fiscal reforms. State infrastructure challenges have a corresponding impact on the national economy. Over the coming 25 years, demand for passenger transport will double. Without action, congestion costs will more than double to $20.4 billion per annum by 2020. By 2050, Australia will require a significant increase in capacity to deal with a tripling of the national freight task. These growth pressures will be underpinned by population growth that will see between 36 and 42 million people living in Australia by the middle of the century. This population growth will require a doubling in recurrent transport infrastructure investment between now and 2030. By 2050, Australia will need to fund a 4-fold increase in annual transport investment, representing an annual spend of more than $63 billion on transport alone. All of this points to a simple truth. Australia needs to change the game for infrastructure. What is needed is a more transparent and realistic public debate about the options that exist to close the gap between Australia's infrastructure needs and what it can currently afford. And that will require an even greater degree of national leadership from the federal government. In his last report to the Council of Australian Governments, Sir Rod Eddington argued, as a country, we are reluctant to increase government debt, balk at raising taxes, are uncomfortable with user pays concepts, and against selling assets and using the proceeds to fund other infrastructure. Yet we are concerned about congestion, water, electricity and telecommunications. There is a profound disconnect here. The point that Rod has consistently made is that infrastructure needs to be paid for, either by governments or through user pays arrangements. And we need to be honest about it. Solutions are going to lie in a renewed public policy debate about how the financial affairs of government can be reformed to create the capacity for the next round of major projects. Of course, Australia has been here before. In the 1980s and 90s, Australia's governments faced similar problems of high government debt levels, inefficient infrastructure and low productivity. The response saw reform on an unprecedented scale. Governments used the sale of assets to pay down public debt, created efficient markets, drove competition into public services, and used the development of revolutionary frameworks like the public-private partnerships to drive up private infrastructure investment. That period of honest debate and difficult reform saw infrastructure investment in Australia surge from around 3.2% of gross domestic product in 1987 to 4.5% by 2006. Contemporary policymakers are going to need to lead from the front about the case for significant microeconomic reform. Australia needs to look again at a sustained program of asset sales and a fundamental reform to the business and cost of government service delivery. Every dollar saved through more efficient public service delivery or the sale of public assets can instead be used to deliver productivity enhancing infrastructure projects. I hope as a businessman, as a taxpayer and as a commuter that the long lead up to September's national election will see a genuine competition of ideas about infrastructure and the broader productivity debate. We need real leadership on infrastructure policy, and we need to see that leadership germinate the kind of bipartisan reform consensus that existed between and across Australia's major political parties at a state and federal level in the 80s. With leadership, honesty and rational reforms, Australia can get a lot done over the next decade. As the construction boom associated with the resources boom tails off, infrastructure can sensibly fill the gap. Australian voters have shown in the past that they are more than capable of participating in a meaningful debate about the way ahead. Perhaps policymakers need to accept the common sense of the Australian voting public and use this national election campaign to engage in a real dialogue about their respective visions for a prosperous, bold and brave road ahead with infrastructure as a focal point. Thank you.